Looking at coastal areas, we'll now look at some of the different types of habitats. Not quite sure why Zoom is doing strange things to my hair, but I will be looking at hopefully mostly the PowerPoint rather than me. So, okay, that's got the PowerPoint started here. Coastal areas, not just the beach itself or wherever the land and ocean are touching, but land and ocean that are near each other are affected. And so we'll look a little bit more broadly at those areas here. A lot of different ecosystems and habitats are going to fall in the general category of coast areas. Some of these are biologically extremely productive. What this means is the amount of new plant growth or algal growth in a particular amount of time is very, very high. These are shallow water areas, and so they're going to be quite strongly impacted by what's going on up in the air with the weather. Waves, tides, all of these are having quite a big effect. We'll look at 5 particular types of settings. Estuaries and lagoons are distinguished by physical features. The salt marsh, mangrove swamp, and coral reef are distinguished by the key things living there that provide a basic framework and type of habitat where other things can live on and around. An estuary. So this is a place where we have fresh water coming from a river flowing into the ocean, and we've got a mixing zone somewhat gradually going from fresh up in the river to normal ocean water on beyond. Now we mentioned deltas. The delta is the pile of sand and mud. The estuary is the water in this area. Not all estuaries have deltas with them, but they can be present. We have 3 styles of estuary as far as the water salinity patterns go, and these depend on the relative strength of the river flow coming in and the tide flow coming in from the ocean. Salt wedge estuaries have the strongest river flow relative to tides. Partially mixed is the balance, and then well mixed is stronger tide, weaker river. These different categories are not always the same for any one estuary. If we're getting rather more river flow, say it's been pretty rainy, that might push things more towards the salt wedge. If we have relatively dry conditions for a while and some extra high tides, that could push it more towards the well mix. So any one estuary, we may see different possibilities. So here's a diagram. The salt wedge, as the name suggests, has this kind of angled wedge-shaped layer of salty water underneath fresh water. And because there's pretty strong river flow, there's a strong supply of fresh water and not so much mixing. Pretty drastic difference in the salinity, so density difference is very strong and mixing is limited. Very strong halocline. We commonly get those along our coast. It's rarely raining this part of the world, so our rivers tend to have a fair amount of water flowing down there. As a result, you can be in the lower part of one of our coastal rivers and say out in a boat, the water right under your boat is fresh. But if you lower a crab trap all the way down to the bottom, you might catch a saltwater blue crab down in the salt wedge underneath. Our partially mixed estuary is where we have the river flow not quite so strong and or tidal flow somewhat stronger. So the freshwater doesn't go quite as strongly, slow down somewhat more chance to have a little mixing. So we don't have as sharp a halicline, it's somewhat more blurred. It's the partially mixed name. In our well-mixed estuaries, the river flow is weak enough, there's plenty of chance for water to mix, and instead of a top-to-bottom zonation with a halicline, we actually have a side-to-side zonation towards one side. Turns out it depends on Coriolis effect. We will have the fresher water, and to the other side, the saltier water. And we have quite a lot of variation. Amazon rainforest, there's so much rain there that actually fresh water from the Amazon River flows out well over the ocean out of sight of land. So you can get some degree of this fresh to salt transition occurring in different places, but typically this is going to be primarily in an area that's kind of enclosed, like in the river mouth area, or perhaps behind some sort of barrier like a barrier island or some peninsula. Estuary, relatively shallow. We've got fresh water coming in, we've got salt water coming in, mixing back and forth. Dry sunny condition, it gets saltier. Rainy days, it gets fresher. Stormy, things are mixed all around. So it's kind of hard place to live. There aren't nearly as many different types of things living in more brackish water areas than either in normal marine or in freshwater, as the diagram here shows. As we start to get salt, the number of freshwater species that can take that drop quite drastically. Now, there are some species that can take a little, but very few as we get on into the higher slanties through the estuary. Similarly, the things that like open ocean, normal, so way out here at 35, fresher things get, the more drops off until we're definitely into estuary conditions. And a lot of ocean creatures don't tolerate that very well. For example, there are quite a few ocean animals that don't have much control over the salt concentration in them. They just kind of track what's around them. But they need a certain level of salt to survive. Too fresh, and that'll be no good. And the little bluish in the middle, we do have some species that are specialized, just found in the more brackish water areas. However, fewer kinds, but if you can put up with the physical difficulties, not so many other things can. So you got less competition. And so you can become very abundant. And there's a lot of food there. The river is washing nutrients down from the land, say bits of dead leaves and things of that sort. Also, gets into the estuary, sinks to the bottom, and along comes the tide, along comes waves, mixes it back up again. So it's not sinking away out of access. It gets kept pretty well available in the water column. And so plenty of food, less competition. If you can stand the changes in salinity and other environmental factors, you can potentially do quite well there. Out in the open ocean, typically our key source of nutrients at the base of the food chain is from planktonic algae, primarily little one-celled things floating around, capturing light energy for their food, and in turn being eaten by things on up the food chain. But in our estuary areas, often the base of the food chain depends more on detritus, bits and pieces, both of say the dead leaves, whatnot, they're coming down the rivers, but also the stuff that grows there. Salt-tolerant plants, such as marsh grasses and mangroves. There aren't too many things that directly eat those when they're alive, but as leaves die, the grass blades die, things like that, then they'll start to decay, be broken down by bacteria and fungi, and then you have lots of things that are eating those bacteria and fungi, and so the food chain. What lives on the bottom? The benthic fauna? Well, what kind of bottom do we have there? Is it mud? Is it sandy? Is it rocky? These will have different properties. As is familiar, if you've been on a sandy beach, sand moves around pretty easily. So sandy areas, generally anything living there has to put up with stuff moving around. If it's more muddy, well, mud can kind of stick together. It doesn't be sticky, so it may not move quite so much. But at the same time, it can be kind of gunky. So you have to deal with that. Rock, if you like something hard to detach on, you'll need some sort of surface rock or perhaps shells for other living things. Because there's a lot of food there and also often places to hide, there are a lot of types of animals where the young will be in the estuary, and then when they get bigger and somewhat better able to defend themselves, then they'll move out more into open ocean areas. This includes a lot of species that are important to us, say seafood, which means that the estuary is important to us. Larger animals, such as big predators, can come in and out of the estuary depending on the tide cycle. For example, at high tide, you could get larger fish, sharks, things like that, swimming in from the ocean. As the tide goes out, they'll move back into the deeper water. Now that gives potentially more access to land-based predators, like, say, wading birds or mammals or raccoons, something like that. Bit of terminology. Benthic mentioned that is things living on the bottom. Planktonic are things in the water that are drifting around. They can't swim particularly faster than typical currents and waves move them around. And so they are primarily drifting, not doing much controlling of where they go. Nectonic, that would be things that are active swimming for their lifestyle. Things like most fish will qualify as nectonic. For example, a whale certainly would be nectonic. There are various types of benthic invertebrates. Again, they have to tolerate the changing slanty conditions. Starfish tend to be a little limited there. There are a few types that put up with lower slanty, but not too many. The picture of the starfish and the spongy are definitely out in open, normal ocean, not actually in an estuary. There are all sorts of different types of worms in oceans. Some of them put up with changing slanty pretty well. Certain oysters are standard native oyster, Crassostea virginica, will do fine in lower slanty waters. Also, because it lives so shallow, it's often exposed by the tide, and so they have ability also to tolerate freezing. Oysters that normally live underwater do not handle that. How do you deal with changing slanty? Possibly it could be that the animal has a way of adding or getting rid of too much water or too much salt to maintain the balance. Some basically just kind of go with the flow and manage whatever the variation is. Many years ago, the summer camp down at the beach, And we had an experiment to see whether some worms were going to increase their weight or stay the same, or how they would change if we changed the salinity of the water they were in. So we had 2 worms to study. We weighed them and then moved them into water with different salinity for a while. And the big worm bit the little worm in 2 and ate the back half. Guess what? Its weight changed. We didn't get very useful results out of that experiment. In contrast to an estuary, where we have river water flowing in, a lagoon is any sort of area that has a degree of being closed from the ocean. It could be partial or completely closed off. Either way counts as a lagoon. But there's no river coming in to provide a freshwater source. The word lagoon may bring up image of some sort of tropical island, but you can have a lagoon from the poles to the equator anywhere. So here we go. Over on the left, river coming in, that's an estuary, that's not a lagoon. On the right, we have examples, one lagoon that's totally enclosed by the sand, separate from the ocean. One that gave about these islands here, there's some barrier, but there's also openings, easier mixing. Now true, water probably trickles through the sand, but it's going to go a lot slower there. Okay, different lagoons, different connection patterns. What is this going to do to affect the salinity of our lagoon? Well, our right-hand one, we've got these gaps here. Of course, every day, tide comes in, tide goes out, and that's going to give a fair amount of mixing back and forth. So that lagoon is not going to be too different from the open ocean. Now, yeah, it is a little enclosed. Probably if we had just had some pretty heavy rains, it would be a little fresher. Or if it had been really sunny and dry, lots of evaporation, it would be a little saltier, but not by much. Not surprisingly, our other lagoon being all the way enclosed, water movement back and forth is much more restricted, and that lagoon could easily become rather more extreme, either extra salty or extra fresh, depending on what was happening with the weather and other conditions. No surprise, it depends on your climate. Are we someplace that's typically more dry and sunny? Say near about 30 degrees north or south. Those areas, well up on land, we often get deserts, and our lagoons would tend to be extra salty. In contrast, if we're someplace where there's lots of rain, say close to the equator, or perhaps more mid-latitude areas, then the lagoon area is going to tend to be fresher than normal ocean, be somewhat brackish. And no surprise, just as we saw with estuaries, having saltier and fresher water around, that may affect the patterns of the flow. Okay, so now we'll look at areas where it's what lives there that is the key distinguishing feature. And the first of these is the salt marsh. These are intertidal flats, so very slightly sloping surface where they're flooded at high tide, exposed at low tide, and marsh means that we've got lower vegetation, grasses, soft plants there, as opposed to a swamp, which is a wet area that has trees in it. So salt marsh means we don't have trees in the marsh. Yeah, there's some trees visible in the background of the picture, but the salt marsh is there in front of me rather than the areas with the bushes beyond. And you can see mud there, and notice that the person with the camera is not headed into the marsh. These are very, very productive. The amount of plant growth happening here is extremely high competitive with the top farm fields for how much growth is occurring per day. Salt marsh, right out on the open beach. The waves, winds will tend to wash things away. Not good for that salt marsh grass to try to grow there. Instead, some more sheltered areas, say the backside of islands or over on the land where it's maybe behind an island or perhaps up into an estuary area, things like that. How much time you're flooded with the tides makes a big difference in what can live where. And so a very subtle difference in elevation. No, we don't need my hands disappearing here. Come on, zoom. uh, just a little bit of difference. Okay, I'll do it that way. It can lead to noticeable differences in what lives where. So with the typical marsh that you'd find, say if you went to the coast here in North Carolina, you could recognize lower salt marsh and higher salt marsh. And the dominant species in salt marshes around much of the world are different types of grasses that are able to some degree to deal with having the salt around. And not just the plants, but the other things that live there. There are a variety of animals and so forth. And what you have where? Well, food availability is quite important. And also you've got a range of distinct environmental tolerances. As the diagram here shows, we have a few different types of plants that tend to be in the high marsh. And here in the eastern US, we basically just have Spartina alterniflora, one type of specialized grass, sometimes called salt marsh cordgrass. If you get a cordgrass basket down in Charleston as a souvenir, for example, it's made from this. And so you've got the different ones in different places. Other species of Spartina are found in many other parts of the world. So fairly similar looking marshes, salt marshes can be recognized in many places. Here are pictures of some of these. You see an area of what a lot of the Spartina, the lower in the marsh and higher in the marsh one. Disticulus is another grass that is quite salt tolerant. It actually also grows in dry desert type places away from the ocean, especially if they're kind of salty, and may be quite a good idea, say, for if you want to have grass on an area there instead of having to use up nice fresh water, you can plant it and it's happy with the water that's normally there. Salicornia here is not a grass, it's noticed to be different. It's sometimes referred to as sea pickle. And Salicornia actually shows up sometimes these days in fancy salads. It is edible. The sea pickle name is kind of appropriate. If you like salty as a flavor, then you might like trying a bit of Salicornia. Managing in salt areas, they have to have some way of doing it. Turns out Spartina will actually grow better in freshwater than in the saltwater here. What's it doing here? It can tolerate the salt, and hardly anything else can. Freshwater, lots of competition, and Spartina is not a great competitor. So even though if it didn't have to do all the work of getting rid of extra salt, it could grow better, it can grow here. Specifically, Spartina is able to get rid of salt secreted out of pores on the plant, a little bit like the way we secrete sweat. Salicornia, on the other hand, doesn't exactly have a way to get salt out of it, but what it does is it concentrates the salt in the ends of those growing branches. Now, eventually, those ends get too salty and dies, and that bit breaks off. but the rest of this plant where it hasn't stored that salt is still doing okay. I mean, it still tastes pretty salty, but not to the point that the plant is dying and breaking off. So that's the way that it gets rid of extra salt. Map here, the greener coastlines are areas that tend to have salt marshes, and the bluer ones with mangroves. Salt marshes are in cooler areas, the mangroves in warm areas. Mangroves characteristically do not tolerate freezing at all. So, for example, they extend roughly halfway up Florida, not to around North Carolina coast. Mangroves are trees that are able to grow in saltwater. Some types, but not all, textbook slide maker, pay attention, have a dense and complex root system that actually grows down from branches. As you can see here, these are not growing down from branches. This is a mangrove that has these kind of spiky bits that grow up from the roots. Why is that? Well, it's thought to be getting up to the air. As you can see, this is not actually in water, but in a muddy area. Get a little water trapped in here, pretty stagnant, not much oxygen down in that mud. And so the plant may be using this as a way of getting oxygen for its roots. At any rate, a different style of rooting. This is black mangrove, as opposed to red mangrove, which is the one that we get, say, in Florida, that has those stilt roots coming down from the branches. So mangroves are prominent plants in tropical to subtropical intertidal areas. Not surprisingly, a tree is a little stronger than grass, so mangroves tend to be a bit more tolerant of wave areas than the salt marsh grasses. They still don't tend to be on the very spots of the beaches that get the most waves, but a little bit more wave action than typically is what the grass is like. Mangroves will still tolerate that. Tidal patterns, what sort of sand or mud you have available, variations in the seawater, especially are we getting somewhat stagnant? Is it getting hypersaline? Is it brackish? Those sorts of things. We've got a few species, depending on how you count, about 3 or 4 that make it to Florida. By far, the greatest diversity currently living is in the tropical Indian Pacific Ocean region, North Australia, Philippines, Indonesia, that part of the world. Like most trees, they will be growing leaves that then die and fall down. And also, there are often things that grow up on the branches, epiphytes, and these may have their own leaves, or the whole epiphyte may perhaps die and fall down. And so it's those dead leaves and bits and pieces falling down that contribute a very important part of the food chain in mangrove swamp areas. Here are pictures of some red mangrove areas. You can see they form a maze-like network of little islands of the trees. If you want to go boating through here, you definitely want to have a map. The bottom photo you can see below and above water. And both above and below provide quite a network of places where animals can potentially hide, surfaces to attach to. So a lot of things like to live in and among these mangrove areas. No surprise, they typically have floating seeds that can drift around to reach new places for them to grow. The red mangrove has a distinctive approach here. the seed actually starts to sprout, especially it gets a root roughly a foot long, while it's still attached to the parent tree. And after that, it'll break off. Sploosh, there it goes into the water. And it floats around, and with that long root part, it floats vertically, as the picture shows here. And floats around a bit. Then when it runs aground, it will start to grow and become a new mangrove tree. Some relatively big animals like it around the mangroves, such as manatees, things of that sort. Manatee population is recovering somewhat, but there are still some significant risks to them. And coastal development can take out their habitat. They like to munch on seagrasses and some algae there in shallow water areas. If that's dug up and turned into a marina, well, that's no place for the manatee. Pollution can be a problem, although what type of pollution? Manatees like warm water. Well, there was the stellar sea cow, a giant one that lived around Alaska, but being big and slow and edible is not a good thing around humans. And shortly after Europeans discovered them, they were hunted to extinction. So our living sea cow type things are in warm water areas. So when we move towards winter, it gets cooler. Manatees will tend to move a little bit south of where they get in the summer, unless there's a spot of warm water, such as a power plant cooling area. Manatees like that. It's a nice toasty spot where they can hang out. Manatees, being kind of big and slow, not too hard for a boat to run into them. Most big manatees around Florida, you can see scars on them from having a boat run into them. Oops. Our less particular type of coastal environment that we'll look at is the coral reef. So this is a structure built up by organisms making hard skeletons out of carbonate minerals. A reef, by definition, is a wave-resistant structure, so something that holds still as waves wash past. It's made up of the assorted skeletons and shells of a wide variety of creatures there. Of course, coral reef is dominantly coral, but there are other possibilities as well. The actual live part of the reef tends to be a relatively thin layer on top of all this old dead skeletons and pieces there, though that surface layer has quite a lot of cracks and crevices going in and out. Shallow water coral reefs are the most familiar reef because of their diversity and widespread occurrence. But there are many other types of reefs. There are deep water coral reefs. As is true of most deep water things, these are quite slow growing, not too hard to damage, and take a very long time to recover. So fishing techniques that just dredge through knocking stuff down, not a real smart long-term plan. Also, besides corals, there are a lot of other things that can make reefs. There are certain algae with hard skeletons, some types of sponges. Some worms make hard tubes. There are some snails that make worm-like hard tubes as well. Clams, like in the oyster reef pictured here. If you go back in the fossil record, there are yet additional types of things making reefs at different times in the past. Focusing on the corals, they are cnidarians, so related to things like jellyfish. And most corals are colonies of many little individual polyps. So the polyp is the animal that makes a skeleton around itself, known as a corallite. And generally lots of corallites together make up one bigger coral colony in a reef. Fairly simple body. They've got tentacles that can be used for catching food around a mouth, and then cavity on the inside used for digestion. Yep, just one opening. And whatever goes out has to go out the same way. It doesn't sound real tasty, but I guess it works for them. Cnidarians characteristically have stinging cells in their tentacles. So now most corals do not sting strong enough to be a problem. There are some types known as fire corals. They're actually part of a different group than the standard true corals that have a sting that can be rather painful to people. The corals that make shallow water reefs characteristically have a symbiotic mutualistic relationship with zooxanthellae. These are a type of little one-celled algae, diaflagellates, that are actually living inside the coral, and they can capture light energy for making food, and extra of that food goes to the coral. The coral provides some of the raw materials that the zooxanthellae need, as well as a nice handy place to live and be somewhat protected from all the things that could eat them if they're just floating around the plankton. So when everything's in balance, the two get along well and we have a mutualistic relationship. Both are benefiting. If things get out of balance, then we have problems. Corals, again, can be solitary or colonial. The reefs primarily occur in warm water for the shallow water ones. Now, too hot becomes a problem as well. Too hot is one good way to throw off the balance between the coral and the zooxanthellae, for example. Corals don't tolerate much change from normal seawater. Certainly can't be fresh or even brackish. And also, no surprise, needing the light for their zooxanthellae, they are not going to like water that is very turbid or murky. Going along with it, corals tend to like it if the water does not have a lot of nutrients in it. Don't they need food? Well, they've got the zooxanthellae helping provide. Turns out if there are lots of nutrients around, that there are soft algae, worms, things like that, that are able to really take over, dominate, and prevent the corals from succeeding. But those aren't building the reef that provides home for so many other things. Now, why is the water around them nutrient poor? After all, there's a lot of things living there. True, but most of the nutrients are in the living things. Not much is floating around loose. So, for example, corals, like many sea creatures, are pretty slimy. And so that slime's washing off all the time out into the water around and getting gobbled up by other things living on the reef, like the sponges. So there's not a lot floating. It's almost all in the living things. A similar situation occurs with the tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest, you've got all sorts of things living there, very diverse. And so if you go in, cut those down and start farming there, pretty soon you've got really, really terrible soil. Now where all those plants of the tropical rainforest growing there if the soil is that lousy? Well, turns out, again, practically all the nutrients are cycling through the system. Very little is buried in the ground, be left behind if you take out the plants and start putting in your own crops. Now there are plenty of dead leaves, and those fall to the ground, and there are loads of fungi and bacteria and small animals and whatnot that are happy to quickly gobble up those dead leaves and break them down, and those nutrients are going right back into the system, not building up in the soil. Again, the shallow water reef building corals like warm areas. So we have highlighted here, the darker blue highlights an area with very stable warm water conditions, not much variation back and forth, and really high diversity of corals and other ocean creatures. Corals grow in various patterns. For example, we have a coral kind of just growing over the surface and a crusting coral up here with a worm on it. Some more branching forms, rain coral with a squiggling form, a little bit more like the encrusting in the shape of the whole colony. One thing I would note, do not pet anything that looks like that. Bright red is often a warning color, and also that fuzzy look tends to suggest that there are stinging spines. It looks suspiciously like it's going to be something in the group known as fireworms, what it feels like if you touch them. More massive encrusting versus tall and branching. What would be advantages or disadvantages there? Well, if you're encrusting, that's going to be more massive, more work in growing that. Branching, that's a little more spread out. Don't have to have as much total mass. Big, massive encrusting, that's going to be pretty hard for a predator to attack that very effectively. A branch is going to be much easier for something to come along and crunch, bite that off. So branches are going to be more vulnerable to predators, or for that matter, to storm waves or things like that. But branching lets you grow up a lot better. Big, massive encrusting thing, not as much so. Growing up into the water, into the sunlight, good for your symbiotic algae, and also good for catching bits of plankton with your tentacles, getting oxygen from the current flowing past, and dumping waste products into that water so they wash away. Big encrusting lump, that's not sticking up as much, doesn't get as much of those benefits. So there are trade-offs. Different types of corals take different strategies here. Coral reefs. Large reefs often show a variety of different features. We may have a main reef with a lagoon between it and land. We can have small patch reefs in between there. Sometimes there's an algal ridge. It's much more typical of the Pacific and Indian Ocean than Atlantic. Not all reefs have that. Over time, as corals grow, more corals can grow on top of that. And so gradually the reef builds out. And we often end up with a relatively steep face out towards the deep water. And of course, different depths, different things can live there. The ones right at the top need to be very sturdy, able to handle the waves. Ones deeper down can be much more soft, not as strong to handle the much slower currents down there. Pictures, a variety of common Caribbean reef fishes that you might see if you were snorkeling or scuba diving, say South Florida, or on into the islands there. Number one down here, nurse shark. Nurse sharks are relatively slow and sluggish, tend to sit around on the bottom a good deal. This is not going to make a very exciting sequel to Jaws if you have nurse sharks. In fact, was at a marine lab in Florida where they were keeping and studying sharks, and specifically nurse sharks were the ones they kept there. Only one person had ever managed to get bitten by one. There were a couple of reasons for this. One, he was taking a blood sample from the nurse shark at the time. So the shark probably was not entirely happy about this. Secondly, in order to try to hold the shark still while he took the blood sample, he actually stuck his hand in the shark's mouth to try to hold on that way. And he got bit. Can't say I really blame the shark. A reef shark, in contrast, is a more active swimmer, predator. Barracuda, similar, very long, streamlined, that kind of long, pointy, either in shape, is often characteristic of ambush predator fish. They'll sit still in the water for a while, hoping that other fish don't notice, and then when one swims in front of it, darts out, chomp, grabs it. Barracuda, fairly big, pointy teeth. Not something you'd want to stick your finger right in front of. We do have occasionally examples of barracuda biting somebody, although often it's because that person was being really stupid, like waiting out in the water and fishing and catching fish and tying those injured fish around their waist while they're fishing standing in the water. Guess what? Injured fish tends to attract a barracuda. Barracuda swims up, tries to bite one of these fish and accidentally gets something besides fish there. The surgeonfish is named because it has right near the base of its tail, there's our cursor, a very sharp structure that you can stick out. As a defense, grabbing it by the tail is definitely not a good idea. You could get a bad cut that way. And we see a variety of others here around the reef. Some additional pictures. Soldierfish here, those rather big eyes. As Little Red Riding Hood knows, big eyes are good to see with, especially if there's not much light. Big eyes like that suggest correctly that these fish tend to be more active when it's nighttime and hide during the day. Parrotfish, in addition to have bright colors like parrots, have a relatively massive beak, somewhat reminiscent of parrots. Parrotfish actually nibble on coral and algae and the stuff growing on dead bits on the reef and crunch it up, digest the edible bits. And the inedible bits, well, they don't digest it, so that goes on through. Yeah, a lot of the sand around a coral reef went through a parrotfish. Lionfish has venomous spines along the back. These are native to tropical Pacific and Indian Ocean areas. Very eager predator, eats quite a lot. Angelfish here, that funny color pattern, tends to break up the outline a bit. At first glance, it's weird patches of color, not quite so obvious that it's a fish. And that may help provide camouflage. Another thing you note, there's this big spot back in the back, and the actual eye is somewhat hidden here. What's the big eye spot back there good for? Well, for one thing, if a predator mistakes that for a big eye, something that big is looking at me, it might eat me. So it might scare off a predator that way. It might provide some confusion as to which way the fish is going for the predator to try to aim. Also, if the predator decides it's going to attack it anyway, for a predator, you don't want to have your prey thrashing around and potentially hurting you as you're trying to kill it to eat it. So if you have a way of killing something fast, that's a good idea as a predator. And now, if you've bitten the face off of something, it's probably going to be dead. Heads are important. So a predator that is attacking will often aim for the head of its prey. If a predator aims for that eye spot, it may just get a mouthful of fin and allow the fish to escape. The grouper up here, groupers tend to be large to very large, not as active predatory fish. They can be sitting and waiting for something to swim in front of them. Again, our reef corals are growing up, trying to reach to the sunlight for their algae. And so reefs are prime real estate, major competition for space. And there are all sorts of things. The corals will be stinging each other and making poisons and trying to grow over each other, and all the other things there, the sponges and algae and bryozoans and everything else is doing all this as well. Over time, things will be growing out. Older dead coral can have other corals growing on it. Some of the algae is also very important in kind of growing over the old pieces and attaching them together. And so we can have reefs building up and out and gradually expanding and giving us different patterns from a fringing reef to barrier and finally an atoll. So we could start, imagine a bit of land. Maybe it's a newly formed volcanic island, for example. And coral larvae reach there, they start to settle around the edges, and we get a reef right around the edge, a fringing reef. Over time, once we have that coral, more coral can start to grow on the edges of that. So our reef will tend to expand out to the sides. Meanwhile, the land may be eroding, and perhaps also, as we saw with making geodes, it can perhaps sink down. And this leads to having a lagoon between the reef and the shore. And this is a barrier reef. If that land keeps on sinking and eroding, it may vanish entirely from sight, and we're left with a ring of coral islands. And there's nothing atoll in the middle, so this is an atoll. A lagoon in the middle, surrounded by a ring of the coral islands. This basic pattern actually is something that Charles Darwin figured out with the voyage of the Beagle. They stopped at various islands going across the Pacific. And Darwin noted not just that, hey, we're stopping somewhere and not feeling so seasick, but also these different features, fringing versus barrier versus atoll reefs, and realized that this could be explained by the erosion and sinking of the central land as the coral grows on out from there. Now, of course, Darwin did not know about plate tectonics, contributing further to the sinking of these areas, nor did he know about the extremes of sea level change back and forth associated with glaciers. The existence of ice ages was just beginning to be recognized about when he was traveling on the Beagle. Didn't really become established knowledge among geologists until after he got back. But those ups and downs in sea level add a complicating factor to the coral reef growth pattern as well. Atolls, most of them are out in the Pacific or Indian Ocean. There's not many here for the Atlantic. Of course, sheltered lagoon in the middle could be a nice place to have your boat. And so these make pretty good harbors. And there's not much else around for that matter, except these coral islands in many parts way out in the Pacific. During World War II, these became rather important harbors for US and Japanese forces. And so some of the famous areas for battles in World War II, such as Tarawa and we thought places of that sort truck were coral atoll areas. However, the most famous of atolls for the name came from a bit after the war. The US was working on further developing the nuclear bomb program. What's someplace way out in the middle of nowhere we can set off a bomb to see what happens without causing too much trouble? Well, there are those islands way out in the middle of the Pacific. That seems suitable. How about this one? There are people there. That doesn't work. Well, we can move the people. Yeah, there was a reason why they were on that island, not the other one. It was a better place to live. But at any rate, that was the approach taken. Hey, we'll help you move and we can do stuff with the island. And so the initial test of the hydrogen bomb took place at one of these atolls named Bikini. And news of this was in the papers. And a French clothing designer thought that his new swimsuit model would make as big a bang as a nuclear bomb. So he called the swimsuit the Bikini. And hence the name of that atoll is rather famous. Though actually the swimsuit was made famous not by the initial designer's effort, but by the pop song about bikinis. Coral reefs are extremely diverse habitats. Many thousands of different kinds of creatures living there. And also you go from one reef area to another and you often find different things. So very, very high diversity. They provide a helpful barrier to protect the coastline behind them from waves and erosion. For example, parts of the coast in South Asia that had coral reefs and or mangrove swamps that were in good condition tended to protect the land behind them when that huge tsunami came. Places where people had damaged the reef, cut down the mangroves, weren't protected. Reefs, significant source of living things useful to us. Seafood, potential medicines. Again, with that intense competition for space on the reef and all potential predators around, one popular approach is basically chemical warfare. Either taste bad or sting things or use other chemicals to try to defend yourself. And these chemicals tend to also have some sort of impact on us, and carefully studying those can lead to useful new drugs. Of course, reefs are fun places to look, all sorts of colorful life there. So they can be significant for tourist or recreational income of various sorts. But that has to be managed carefully, the fishing and tourism, to not be damaging the reef. Estimated that close to a third are at high direct risk from human activities. For example, poor land use nearby can lead to dirt washing down into the ocean, making it murky, burying the coral in mud. Changing freshwater flow if we make things too fresh around the reef. Sewage, those nutrients, those aren't going to be good for the coral. There may also be viruses, other things causing trouble there. All too often that fancy looking beachfront tropical hotel has a pipe going just out into the water near it. That's not real good. It's, well, not actually really what you want to be swimming in, for that matter. not just in countries that are less developed. A number of cities in South Florida are trying to fight rules saying that they can't just dump their sewage out in the ocean. They might think twice about what sort of message that's sending to the tourists coming to the beaches. Other things washing off of farm besides mud, you also have things like fertilizers, pesticides, that can be a problem. Oil spills, oil tankers going past reef areas. Bad fishing techniques, for example, dynamite. If you take some dynamite, light it, toss it in the water, that boom creates a shock wave in the water, which can stun or kill fish all around. They float up to the surface and you can pick them all up pretty easy. But that's certainly not real good for the environment around. Fishing with cyanide. What's up with that? Well, you kind of figure that's probably not what you want for the fish you're eating. That tends to instead be used in catching fish like to sell for aquarium. If you put a bit of cyanide in the hole in the reef, then stuff hiding in the hole is going to come out. You can grab it. Of course, you poison the coral around it. Good chance you poison the fish somewhat, but if it stays alive long enough for you to sell it, you made your money. Of course, you're killing the reef where you got stuff to make money off of. That's not a smart long-term plan, like a lot of these other things. But it's done. It is a problem that has to be recognized. Deciding you'd rather have land than the reef, building stuff up into the land. For example, having some issues with that in the area between China, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, that region in there. China wants to claim that area, and so to show it's theirs, they've built a base on one of the little tiny coral islands there. Not good news for the coral. Of course, the neighboring countries aren't real happy with this either. Tourism, careless tourism, banging into reefs, grabbing things. There are various problems there. Mining the coral to use for limestone, building rock, whatnot. All corals are impacted by global warming and the associated ocean acidification. As conditions get more acid, it's harder for the corals to make their skeletons. Warmer conditions tend to throw off the balance between the coral and their algae. If it gets too hot, the algae can't photosynthesize, but they're still glad to mooch off the coral for the stuff they would be getting if they were providing stuff to the coral. And the coral isn't real happy with the deal, tends to dump the algae, but then it's not getting food from them that way either. And unless conditions recover quickly and the coral and algae can reestablish a good relationship, the coral could start to die off under those conditions. If we look back at the fossil record, we see that reefs tend to be relatively vulnerable. Anytime there's a big extinction, reefs are one of the things that crash. Another problem, the picture here, lionfish. They're supposed to be around coral reefs in the Pacific Indian Ocean, but they are now here and spreading in the Atlantic thanks to humans. It's not entirely certain to what extent this is hurricane hits somebody with a aquarium and fish escape there, or if somebody gets the, ooh, this is fun to look at the aquarium, wouldn't it be fun to look out in the ocean? I'll take it there. That's not a good plan. Okay, so 5 very important types of coastal habitats.